This episode is brought to you in part by Samply. Samply makes the process of dealing with mix revision notes super easy. Make sure to check them out online at samply.app. And while you're there, get 3 months off any plan free by simply using the coupon code MYM at checkout. Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Sean Moffitt, and if you're not familiar with Sean, Sean is a mixing engineer who has won multiple Grammy Awards. He's worked with artists such as Jelly Roll, Miranda Lambert, Mercy Me, We the Kingdom, Brian Kelly, and a whole bunch more. And in today's episode, we cover a wide range of topics. One of the first things that we get into is the topic of being a mixing-only engineer. And Sean has some really interesting perspectives on how to get started as a mixing-only engineer. Because a lot of people get into kind of full production stuff where they'll do the recording, editing, and mixing. But if you want to be a mixing engineer only, you're heavily dependent on other people to help boost up your portfolio. So how do you get started so that you can showcase your best work? Because you can be the best mixer, but if you have crappy recordings that someone gives you, it's going to really limit how good your portfolio sounds. So Sean has some pretty interesting takes on how to work on building your portfolio, to lead with your best foot forward, and to help propel your career. We also talk a lot about Sean's workflow as far as how he gets started with mixes. And one of the things that he loves to do is that he likes to start by basically using the rough mix or the actual session files that artists give him. And so we dive into how he navigates working through those different sessions that might be in different DAWs and that have different routing and a whole bunch of other stuff. Because it is interesting and it does provide a lot of insight into, what an artist, what their vision is for their song. So we get into Sean's approach for dealing with that. And we also talk about Sean's interesting approach to creating width in a mix. Often when we think about width, we think about things like panning. But Sean actually has a different approach. And it's really interesting. And I think that it makes a lot of sense when you hear what he's doing. I think you're going to really enjoy that part of the conversation. So with that said, this episode has so much good stuff in it. So let's just jump right into it. Sean Moffitt, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. What's going on, dude?
Hey, man. Good to see you.
Thanks for being on, man. For people who might not be familiar with you, can you give us your background on who you are, what you do, how you got into music production, and all the cool stuff you're working on these days?
Yeah, man, I started out as a drummer back in my teenage years and early 20s. And I had an opportunity to tour a bunch when I was younger with various bands and kind of lived on the road for 4 years. And basically, through that whole process, I eventually had an opportunity to record and go into a studio as a drummer with one of the bands I was playing with at the time. And I just kind of got really mesmerized by the recording process and the other side of the glass. And it kind of bit me like a naggy bug, and I just couldn't shake it. And so I kind of pivoted when I was around 23, 24 and kind of hung up the drums and pursued audio just for the absolute love of the fact that you can craft and make really cool choices and change tones. And it just really inspired me. So I kind of went for it after that.
That's cool. So how did you ultimately learn the production side of things then?
Well, I basically started making my own music first. I'm a musician. I can play other instruments besides drums, very, very basic, but can get around and play other instruments. And so when I was younger, I just was so desperate to experience recording and making music in that capacity again. I started making my own music and then mixing it and learning it. And then I got real into it. So I decided way back in the day to go to Full Sail. And that was just a great experience for me out there. And I learned a lot about signal flow and Pro Tools. And then after that, out of school, I got a job with this composer named Brian Keane, who is out of Connecticut. And he is it was a very established composer, producer, writer that would do a ton of ESPN, HBO, PBS documentaries. And I ended up being the Pro Tools guy for him for about 3 years. And I just really was able to establish my chops in Pro Tools because it was just a heavy dose of editing and tuning and all these different things. So I got a lot of skill set and knowledge by working for him for a couple of years, and then doing all those different processes from recording to editing to mixing. I decided that like what really resonated with me the most was mixing. And then just like anybody else, everybody's story is different, but I just started to kind of pursue mixing. I started my career in Connecticut and New York. I also, in those days, was an assistant to a legendary mixer in his time named Elliot Shiner. And so I spent about a year with him as well and gained a lot of knowledge. And by a friend, I met some people here in Nashville and started working for a few producers on the mix front, long distance, which back in that day was a little bit more of a thing and more of a challenge than it would be now. And I just kind of was really inspired by the community in Nashville. So my wife and I decided to make a move 16 years ago. And it was the best thing we ever did. And we moved to Nashville and the career started growing.
That's awesome. What was it specifically about mixing that you felt compelled to stick with, as opposed to like the producers that kind of do everything, or, the engineers, that kind of thing?
For me, it just felt like in mixing, there was just the most amount of like artistry and crafting, and kind of like I was fascinated with the fact that you were like, second to the last stage of the game, and you just had a lot to you could express yourself the most in mixing, I guess. You know what I'm saying? And then, this town, Nashville, has a really good way of kind of creating a path for you. Obviously I did a lot of tracking and I did a lot of recording and production, but once the mixing thing kind of took off, I started just heavily focusing on that. So
yeah, absolutely. That's cool. Yeah, I feel like being a mixer only can be very like challenging in a lot of ways, because you're heavily dependent on the source material that you get, right? As opposed to like being the person who kind of sees it from the ground up and you're doing the recording and the editing, the mixing, like you're a little bit more control there, right? But when you're just a mixing engineer, you definitely have to rely on having good engineers sending you tracks to work with. Obviously you can save some projects, but I'm sure you have to get good at some of those creative mixing decisions to polish up tracks, right?
Yeah, I mean, I had this conversation with young mixers all the time, and it is really, really hard when you're first starting as a mix engineer to make the transition from starting out and working with whoever will hire you. And then I ran into an issue when I was first getting started where I learned really quick that, your mixes are only good as what you get. And a lot of times, in order to grow into a career, it's like, hey, let me hear what you do. Like some producer I'm seeking out to play with, to work with. Hey, like, I want to show you what you got, but you don't really have anything good to show them because the audio isn't good. And so every mixer's journey, like there has to be some opportunity where someone takes a risk on you and sends you really good stuff, and you do what you need to do. But it is a challenge when you're first starting out. Like, how can I make these great sounding mixes without great material? And there always has to be some sort of someone taking a risk on you in the beginning in order to make that jump where actually you have something that you can play for somebody that would make them interested in potentially working with you. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting point. And I think it's something a lot of people don't even think about, is that like, yeah, if you want to get into mixing, it's like you could be a great engineer, a great mixing engineer, but like if you're getting crappy material on the way in, like that talent of yours never really fully shines. So you definitely need to find those opportunities to work with people who know what they're doing on the tracking side of things.
Yeah, and that's something I have encouraged my assistants over the years, is like, hey, you have access to all these great songs and great material. Like, if I finish a record, open up a session, start from scratch, and work on that stuff and build your chops. And that's something I've really, I've been very, very blessed to have. 6 assistants over the last 15 years, and all of them have grown to be successful. And I think a lot of that has been, just the nudge to like, hey, this track is amazing. This material is amazing. Like, open it up on your own and try to beat my mix, or not even beat it, but do your own thing. But until you have great material, it's really hard to grow. And that's a challenge for young guys coming up, that somehow you just got to figure out how to navigate. But it really breaks down to someone giving you a chance,
Yeah. So as far as like people who are at that stage where they're trying to become mixers, but they don't necessarily have great source material. Like, do you have any advice for people to find those opportunities?
Well, I was very lucky and I kind of fell into a situation. I very early on in my career, I met this very talented producer named Brent Milligan. And I would gently and very hopefully, kindly and not abrasive would just really hit him up in my early days and be like, dude, I really want to work with you. And he wouldn't in the beginning. But what I did allow him to do and was so kind of him to do is he would do these records. And when he finished them, he would send me a few sessions from, I think maybe like 8 records over the years early on. And man, I would just go to the woodshed and I would take these great recorded songs, great, productions, and I would just work on them and try to mix them like by myself. Like no one heard these songs. Like I would just spend a week on a song and kind of learn. And he was kind enough to send me the final mixes of these songs. And it was a really, really sweet and beautiful thing that he did for me early on that I still owe him so much thanks for, because I was able to like mix these songs for myself and kind of compare them to what was the finished product and sort of build confidence and learn how to really execute with good material. And every once in a while I would send him one, not with no agenda, but just, to get his feedback. And he started hearing them and really liked them. And then that's how he essentially gave me a shot. And that was kind of like Brent Milligan is one of the first major record producers that I was able to work for. And he was a huge part of my trajectory.
That's awesome. So I'd love to shift gears and talk a little bit about your process then. Like when it comes to starting a mix, what's your normal like mindset or like approach? Or do you have a specific workflow that you follow? Like how do you start a project?
I don't know if I'm splitting any atoms by doing this, but with my assistant and with my approach, it is imperative and will not start a song until what I have in front of me in my world through my rig represents exactly what the rough mix is. I choose to start exactly where the producer left off. Now, that being said, I'm lucky enough to work with really, really talented producers these days. And the bottom line, my philosophy is in the early days, mixers would often send a mix to the team and it would be literally the first expression of this beautiful production. But nowadays, all these songs that I get to work on have been spoken into and have gone through a lot of people before they even get to me. And so it's very rare that in the mixing process, I'm reinventing the wheel and I'm just enhancing what has already been approved. And so for me, the main goal, and my assistant is great at doing it, is to start where the producer leaves off. And that takes owning a ton of plugins twice for me and my producer and my assistant. But I've found that over the years, it's really the only way to go. So, and then I basically listen to the rough mix and decide, first off, most importantly, what I need to leave alone, what is right about this song, which I think is one of the hardest parts of mixing is the experience and knowledge to know when to leave something alone. And then I'll just go through and be like, how can I enhance what's already here and get it over the finish line? But primarily, I always start where the producer leaves off. And if I have to, that sometimes I call the producer like, hey, like you send me raw vocals, but I really think your process vocals is the call on this song. And so can you print that for me? Or sometimes I get a song where the drums are processed in a certain way that I feel boxes me in their corner, and vice versa. I ask them, hey, can you send me raw files? But the initial approach and the initial heart behind the thing is to start where they leave off. And that's led to the most success for me.
So are you literally taking like their Pro Tool sessions or whatever and just working from that? Or are you kind of reinventing that, getting it as close to the rough mix as possible, and then going from there?
We receive songs in all DAWs. So whether it be Ableton, Logic, Nuendo, whatever, my sort of tag phrase is save and send. Like basically just send me the session and we'll take care of the rest. And then I have a team that, I have one main assistant that is with me every day. His name's Jace. He's killing it. And then I have a few other guys that are really good in other DAWs. And so I will hire them essentially a la carte to go through a session and make it work in my world. So basically it's, I have certain things in my Pro Tools setup that need to be implemented into what has been sent to me. So that's the main job, and they do really good a job at that. So
gotcha. So at the end of the day, it's still going into a Pro Tools session. You're just starting from whatever they gave you originally.
Correct. Yeah. Like for me, first and foremost, mixing is a service business, and many years ago, I decided, hey, what a weight it would be to take off a producer if I could just take sessions and not have them need to stem things out. Like I would take care of it, and people seem to really love that. And then, but at the end of the day, I'd say 90% of the songs I do come in at Pro Tools, and, I just open up their session and implement my sort of starting point into their session,
That's cool. I imagine that getting that insight into what went into the rough mix, you probably learn a lot of new tricks.
I'll tell you, one of the biggest gifts about doing it this way is probably not what people would think, but one of the greatest things that with doing it in that process in that way is I get to learn things that I've never would have tried. Like I would open up a session for producer and I'd be like, man, this session sounds great. And then I'd look at his vocal chain and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I would never use that plugin to do that. Or I've never thought about like paralleling it with this or that. And so it's kind of like an inside like learning experience for me to see how other people are approaching music. And I would definitely say that, the really talented producers out there that at least I'm working with, a lot of them are better mixers than they give themselves credit. And so I've gained a lot of knowledge and intel based upon what they're sending me.
That's very cool. So do you find then when you're opening up a session from someone else and you've seen, their routing setup and all that kind of stuff, like, are you trying to preserve as much of that as possible? Or like, does it eventually kind of like, do you have your own kind of template or your own setup for mix that you like to work off of and then you'll adjust accordingly?
Well, it's interesting. The way things are routed in my session are my thing. Like it has to be routed a certain way, so I will not follow necessarily routing from a song that comes in. But the challenge is when you get a song is to be able to recreate the rough and route it the way I need to do my job. So, and that's a skill set in itself. So, at the end of my session, I have multiple buses where everything lands, which I do a lot of work on when I'm mixing a song. But it's essentially the exact session they send me, like implemented into my routing, basically. Like, and I don't have a template. The template that I have is their song. And it's just the challenge is routing it appropriately for me to do my job, basically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like you're just trying to keep as much as possible, print things where need be, and then shape it to your way of working and not having to like recreate the wheel every time.
Yeah, I don't have like go-to vocal chains. I don't have go-to like I don't get a session and then all of a sudden it's going through my mix bus or my drum bus. Like oftentimes my mix bus is an expression of their mix bus, either tape enhanced, tweaked, or modified, but it's built off their mix bus.
Gotcha. That's very cool. Yeah. I think that's a really cool way of working, and you obviously have to be very flexible to adapt to that kind of thing. But at the same time, you learn a lot, and it really does help to preserve a lot of that vision that the artist has, and you're not trying to start from nothing.
Correct. Yeah. Like I view like the transition between production to mix is like, like if someone's running the decathlon and they're running and then all of a sudden they pass the baton to the next guy. And then I just start running with what has already been started. You know what I'm saying? It's not like, hey, this is my song now and it's going into my world. It's like, how can I join your world and enhance it?
Yeah, very cool. Love that. Hey, just want to take a quick second to tell you all about our awesome podcast sponsor, Samply, which is an app that I've been using for a while now that has made the process of mix revisions with clients so much easier. In the past, I used to get vague emails from clients about what sections needed fixing, and it was always a bit of a guessing game. But with Samply, I can upload my mixes, send my clients a link to a playlist where they can listen losslessly, and then they can add timestamped comments directly on the files. I can then import these notes into my DAW and have them perfectly synced up to my session. So there's no more guessing. Another feature that I love is their playlist embedding. Right now on my website, I have a lossless playlist of my portfolio so that any potential client can hear my work at full quality. No more crappy sounding, low resolution MP3 files. Instead, people can hear my work at its best. And the icing on the cake, Samply integrates with a ton of different services. And one of my favorite integrations is their integration with SoundFlow. With just one click, Samply can export my mix from my DAW, upload it to Samply, and then send clients an email for where they can hear their song. One button, that's all it takes. It's a major time saver. So Samply has really streamlined my workflow, and I know that they can do it for you too. So make sure to check them out online at samply.app. And you can get 3 months off any Samply plan for free by simply applying the coupon code MYM at checkout. Well, I'd love to dive into some elements of your mixes because there's a lot of great stuff in them, and I'm curious to learn a little bit more about those processes. So one thing that definitely stands out to me when I listen to your mixes is that I feel like you do a great job of getting the low end right. Like your mixes just feel like they've got a big, tight low end, and so I'm just curious to know, like, when it comes to like managing low end in your mixes, what's your secret for that?
To be honest with you, it's pretty minimal, my approach to low end. I don't usually do a ton of compression or carving. A lot of the low end expression leans on what's going on in the mix bus for me, and just kind of making sure that gain staging is right, and that the kick and whatever, whether it be a bass guitar or 808, like, are talking to each other and are in synergy. You know what I'm saying? But I find that the more aggressive and the more carving and the more sort of digging in on the low end, it gets worse. So basically, I have a pretty minimal approach, but I do have to decide early on in a song, like, is the kick going to carry the punch or is the bass going to carry the punch? And that's song specific. Often if you have a great 0808 or a solid bass guitar, you can actually, and depending on the cadence of the song, the groove, the rhythm, you can also get a kick sounding super punchy by having it carved and letting the bass in tandem, like, create that punch. You know what I'm saying? So I'm pretty minimal, but you kind of have to figure out which element, as far as the punch goes, is going to be the star, like the kick or the bass. Every song's different, but that's kind of the first sort of thing that I look at and decide, who's going to carry the load and the punch on this song, the bass or the kick. And yeah, so that's kind of my approach. And it takes a little messing around and deciding which one's better,
Yeah, of course. You mentioned mix bus there. Like, do you kind of take a top-down approach with your mixes and start from the mix bus first?
Yep. I go to the last part of the song. I make sure that my limiting and compression and everything, gain staging, is where it needs to be, like, and functioning as loud as like a finished product would be. And then I start making decisions. I find that, like, if you add 3 dB of limiting after you do a mix, like, everything changes. So I 100% get my gain staging and loudness solidified before I do much work on any song. Yeah.
Makes sense. Are you concerned about loudness levels? Like, it sounds like to some degree you're obviously factoring it in. Like, you need to be aware of how it's going to sound when things are louder. But, like, I know some people will say, like, oh, I always shoot for like -6 on my master bus, or some people say they don't care. It's like, what's your philosophy there?
I think that decision is extremely song dependent. I basically push the song as loud as it can go where my ears don't feel like it's suffering. So sometimes that's -8, sometimes that's -5. It just depends on the content. But my whole philosophy when I send out a mix is that it could go out to the world as is. So as far as level goes, I get it to as hot as I feel is appropriate for the song. And if mastering can enhance that or get it louder, so be it. But I work with phenomenal mastering engineers that I love, but I really don't try to rely on their process to get me over the line. I want my song to be able to go out to the world pre-mastered.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think that's a good point to bring up too. Like, if you are sending it to mastering engineers, I guess you have to have that relationship with your mastering engineer to know what they prefer, what they need. And, some mastering engineers are picky about that stuff and some aren't. So I guess it comes down to the people you're working with and knowing how it gets affected down the line, right?
Yeah. I mean, for the most part, I'm lucky that I'm in the stage of my career where I keep my mastering circle pretty small. And I tend to try to push the client or the producer to work with people that I feel comfortable working with. I strongly, and this has been solidified over the years, believe in mixer mastering relationships. I think that certain guys work well with each other and certain don't. I don't think it's just I've experienced in the years of doing this that some guys just don't ham and egg with what I do, and some do. And so I just try to keep and encourage people to use the people that seem to work well with what I do, you know?
Yeah. As far as picking a mastering engineer for you goes, like, what do you ultimately look for in a mastering engineer?
That's a great question. I look for transients being preserved, like 100%. A perfect master to me is something that sounds better and more finished, but not even really being able to identify what they did. That's kind of a weird explanation, but Joe Laporta is the master of this. When I said I've done a ton of work with Joe Laporta over the years, and he has this ability to A, preserve my transient information, and B, just have the song come back sounding better, but I can't ever put my finger on what he actually did. I think his process is incredibly transparent, but it always seems to be enhanced and more correct, but not really I'm not like, oh, he had a top end or oh, the low end's tighter. It's like, oh my gosh, this feels better. It sounds very close to what I did, but just better. And, I've had the most success with him over the years in that process.
Yeah, it almost sounds like you're kind of looking for someone who is enhancing it in like the smallest amounts, but it's doing its magic.
Yeah.
It's not someone who, yeah, you're going to get the master back and be like, oh yeah, they made things brighter, or, like they changed up the mix.
Yeah. By no means am I like, my mix is done and I'm not open to an expression of a mastering engineer, but I work really, really hard with my clients and artists to make sure that this song is where it needs to be before mastering. So 9 times out of 10, it coming back very different is usually not a good thing. And I think a lot of mixers would agree with me on that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that also comes with a lot of experience too, right? Like when you're younger, you're kind of like, you're not sure about your mixes, you're not as confident. So you kind of send it off to a mastering engineer hoping that they're going to perform a miracle, as opposed to someone in your position who is like, you're confident in your skills now, so you can get the results that you want.
Correct. Yeah. And I think it takes a lot of years and a lot of, time under your belt for mastering engineers to be able to leave a song alone if it doesn't need to be touched. I think that takes a talent first off and just experience, because a young mastering engineer starting out trying to make a name for himself, like, would often probably feel like they need to really push into it and it'd be different in order to essentially justify their work. But I find the best mastering engineers, like, what puts them on top from other guys is knowing when not to do anything,
Absolutely. I think that's just like that's a thing that just happens in people's careers. It's like when you get started, you're so new, you don't know anything, you play it safe, and then all of a sudden you like learn all these tools and you feel like you need to use them all, and you go through that period of your career where it just like it just kind of gets like too experimental, or you go too far, and then people realize like, oh, I can dial back. And I think that relates to a lot of mixing engineers. I think it relates to a lot of mastering engineers. So it's finding people that can complement each other's stages. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I agree. It's well put.
Yeah. Another element of your mixes that I'm curious to ask about is that I think you do a great job when it comes to how you treat the stereo width in a mix. Like, I feel like when I listen to your songs, I can feel the chorus is just like growing and getting bigger. And like, I love that. I think it creates movement in the track and it just makes things sound exciting. And that's not to say that your verses or whatever would sound like narrow and everything's mono. I just think you're like very strategic with where you place things and how a song grows. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but that's just kind of my perspective of it.
Well, first off, I appreciate that. That's a great compliment. And that certainly is the goal. Yeah. I mean, I find that you can get great width out of a song by attenuating frequencies that are not needed. And again, I'm not splitting any out. I'm saying that like mostly my approach, with carving sounds and creating space in mixes is much more about attenuation than enhancements. And, when you're listening to a chorus, you just have to decide what frequencies are masking this from not feeling like, the worst thing about a chorus is when it feels stuffed, like that is stuffy. And I find that like you can be pretty aggressive in attenuation in certain instruments in order for other instruments to create width that work well on the sides. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. So are you then relying a lot on like automation to take care of the plugins and in addition to volume and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Again, so basically all the music that I work on lands on auxes at the end of my session. So I have like kick, perk, loops, bass, guitar, acoustics, electrics, backing vocals, lead vocals, effects. And I often have EQ automated on those auxes depending on the section of the song. And so there's a lot of automation on those groups at the end of the song that to create scene changes, essentially. You know what I'm saying? And basically a lot of my heavy lifting in the mix front are done on those auxes as opposed to individual tracks. Like, so basically I go through all the individual tracks and I try to make the group of the electric guitars function in the way they need to, and then treat them as a group section by section.
Makes sense. So what would be some of the typical moves that you would try out at that stage in the process? Like what kind of EQ moves do you just instinctively want to try right away?
I find that dipping like 300 hertz and 700 hertz and a lot of pad, guitar, choir help establish width. I think those are essentially within range of, like 100, you got to look at 100, you got to look at 300, you got to look at 700 hertz. Those to my ears are frequencies that tend to mask and make a chorus or a song feel full. So carefully going through and kind of looking at those areas of frequencies seem to really open up a mix for me.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. And that's a good point, because definitely like the choruses is where that's where people stuff their songs. They throw in all the layers. Yep. They try to go big. And a lot of people think that like more layers equals bigger sound, but it can very easily tighten or make things sound too cluttered, and you don't get that clarity in that width definition, I guess.
Yeah. And I'm not afraid to mute. There's often times where in a chorus or even a bridge or a verse for that matter, like, might have three pads trying to accomplish the same thing. And, often I'll kind of go through and see, all right, this pad and this pad and this pad are kind of doing the same thing. Which one does it the best? And I'll get rid of the other ones, and that seems to like free up a mix a little bit and give a little bit more space,
Yeah. So then when it comes to your approach to panning, how do you go about figuring out where you want everything to live and kind of mapping out how it's going to evolve throughout the song?
I would say that inherently I am much a left-right, hard left-right kind of guy. I love leaving as much room as possible for the vocal. My go-to would be just hard right, hard left, and with effects, like making sure that it certain instruments speak mono as well. But panning-wise, like my default would be, especially in choruses, is not really having that much of actual direct instruments speaking very much in the center, and letting the kick, bass, and vocal really occupy that space. And if I have a song where there's like two beautiful guitars speaking to each other left and right, and if it feels a little bit too separated from each other, a great short delay or a room or a reverb could kind of get those two to talk in the middle a little bit more. But it's rare, especially in choruses, that things are not left-right for me. Hard to left-right. Yeah.
And how much of those decisions that you're making as far as panning goes, how much of that is influenced by that rough mix that you get?
Extremely influenced. That's, to me, even from the panning front is a total expression of production. I can change my mind or offer something different, but usually I consider even like the placement of instruments like a production decision, and I try to honor that the best I can.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting too, because at the end of the day, you're clearly, you're trying to provide the producer or the artist the best version of their vision. And often, like, I think about like drums, for example. Like as a drummer myself, I always like to pan things from drummer perspective because it makes sense to me. But I know that like sometimes I get rough mixes and it's the opposite. And I'm like, that's just what they want. It's like, I got to honor that. And little things like that maybe don't matter to anyone else, but you have to consider that kind of detail.
Absolutely. Panning to me is a total expression of production, and if an artist lived with a rough mix for, 3 weeks before it got to me and a certain guitar is on the right, it's gonna like completely thrown for a loop if all of a sudden that guitar is in the left, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Another thing I was curious to ask about is that, from my understanding, you have a hybrid mix setup, right? Are you still doing that?
Yeah, oh yeah, still.
So what does that look like? Like, could you describe what that looks like for our audience?
I have a bunch of hardware available on inserts, but it is extremely rare that I use outboard gear on a mix bus ever these days. And it's not even a convenience choice. It's more of a quality. Like I find that I get best results when I use plugins for my master bus, but there are certain individual instruments or groups that I will use inserts on. And that's a game day decision. And that's something that's committed once it's crafted. So at the end of the day, when I have a song sent to a client, there's nothing, everything's in the box by the time it goes to them. But I will run bass out to certain compressors and I will use stereo compressors on drums, but that will be committed before it leaves the room, if that makes sense.
So you kind of have like a dedicated compressor for your bass or for your drum bus or whatever, and like those are the things you just audition during the process.
Yeah. And I used to have a setup in my mix prep where I could audition a stereo. Like, you know, I used to have it where I could literally, as a switch, be able to audition summing through outboard compression on the master bus versus in the box and make a decision real quick on which way I wanted to go. But I've just found for so many reasons, especially for me, because I do print relatively loud, I find that in order to get the appropriate loudness for a song, oftentimes analog gear gets in the way of that on the master bus. So I've just kind of made a decision to keep the master bus, you know, in the box.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that from a committing perspective, it's so much easier to commit the individual tracks than it is your bus, right? Every revision, you got to go back through that chain and repeat it all over again.
Yeah. And analog gear does not handle, in my experience, does not handle loudness in which the market requires these days. So to get the song as loud as it needs to be, I often feel like I'm playing defense when I have it hitting analog gear on the master bus.
Interesting. That's cool. Another thing that I was curious to ask about was your mix room itself. You know, I think a lot of people, when they think of like professional mix rooms, they imagine this like big room with a big console in front of you, racks of gear surrounding you and everything. But when I've seen some videos online of your setup, I don't know if they're the most up to date, but it looked like you have a pretty minimal setup where you just got like a TV on the wall, one set of speakers in front of you, and like a pretty tiny desk in front of you, just holding your keyboard and mouse. Is that still the same sort of setup that you have?
Pretty much. I have a well, I can even show you. Over here I have, you know, a rack of, you know, a lot of gear, you know, but it's not in front of me. I went on a quest for ultimate loudness. I went on a quest for the best sound I could get in a room, and I did a lot of shooting of the room, and I found out that this Argosy desk that I had for many years really affected what I was hearing. So I kind of went on a quest for a minimal approach, and I was working with a client. I worked on a project with a client for almost a year straight, and he really wanted the ability to be able to like go up to a screen and like point and move stuff around. And so I went to this big TV really to accommodate him because we were deep in it. I'll never go back. Having a huge, like, you know, 90-inch screen in front of me helps with fatigue. I have recently gone into Atmos, so I now have more speakers in the room, obviously. You know, I try to keep, you know, I basically have a monitor controller, mouse, keyboard, and a Stream Deck on my desk, and that's it. And I don't think I'll ever go back to that.
So you said that your old Argosy desk was causing problems. Like, how would you describe the difference between what you had before versus what it is now?
Well, I was just getting a flatter response without a massive, like, essentially bass trap and reflections in front of me, you know, like, and a big Argosy desk is a big piece of math, and it was affecting the audio, like, because it was reflecting and messing with the bass response. So when I got to the minimal approach, I was just getting a much flatter response out of my room without a massive piece of furniture, like sitting around, like, you know, basically surrounding me when I was hearing playback.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's interesting because you would almost think that like an open concept room would cause more trouble for acoustics because you'd have more, like the sound could travel and bounce a little bit more. I don't know. Maybe that's just kind of what I thought it would sound like, but I imagine that like getting the acoustic treatment in the right spots and making it feel balanced, like that could be a little bit of a challenge for an open concept room.
Yeah, yeah. I've found that the deeper your control room is, the better bass response you'll get. And I have my control room is almost 30 feet deep. And so it gives a lot of room for the bass to travel and not come back at me, you know? My room is, I wouldn't say it's not going to get a tech award any day soon, but it's very flat and deep and spacious and minimal. And it causes me not to feel trapped, when I'm spending 12 hours a day in a certain spot. And when clients come in, there's a lot of space. And so we're not on top of each other. So it's just kind of what I fell into. This room I'm in is actually an exact clone to 1/8 of an inch of a previous room that I had. And when we decided to move, I recreated my old studio to the 1/8 of an inch in this house. So I feel like I kind of just got lucky. I met a really talented guy named Mike Therrett about 10 years ago, and we did our first room together in my old house, and I loved it. And so we recreated it in this house. And I have found, and I would encourage people who are building rooms to find out, I've found the better bass response you get, the deeper the room is.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yep.
And it's funny because as I was asking that last question, I was kind of realizing like, well, yeah, if everything is more open, then you do have more room for the wavelengths to travel. And yeah, I guess there would be less reflections because
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you don't have things in the way, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And the quicker bass hits something, the more problems you have. You know what I'm saying? So, if you had a 12-foot deep room, like that bass is going to get kicked back to you, and you have to have a mass amount of bass trapping in order for that not to happen. But with like a 28-foot deep room, the bass travels and kind of disperse on its own. And I do have a ton of bass trapping in my room in the front. And then I have a fabric wall, and then there's 5 feet of space between the fabric wall and concrete block. And behind that fabric wall, I have more bass trapping and diffusion. So the bass just finds its home pretty easily with a deeper room.
I love that. It's interesting to hear. Like, I love hearing when people say like, oh, I've got like 5 feet deep of insulation or whatever blocking or like for bass trapping. It makes you realize like how much is actually necessary to really control some of that stuff.
Yeah, and I might be different in the fact that, but I actually have drywall in my mix room. And I don't mind it. I mean, I have, as you can see, a lot of paneling above me and in front of me and to the sides. But I actually, once you have your paneling right, I actually enjoy the liveliness that drywall brings. It doesn't make it feel like a coffin in here. So I do have exposed drywall in my mix room, and I've had zero issues with it. It's just, you have to treat it right, but there is an element of liveliness that is in my room that I prefer.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. Another thing that I was curious to ask about was that, at least in the video I saw of your studio, it looked like you had, this has probably changed now that you're doing Atmos, but it looked like you only had one set of speakers in front of you. And then you also had a couple like auxiliary sets of speakers at other spots in your room. And yeah. I was curious to know about that decision and why you chose to go with that as opposed to having 3 pairs of monitors in front of you and using a monitor controller or something like that.
Yeah. So basically, for many, many years, I had a pair of Dynaudio BM5As, which were my first set of speakers before I went to the Proax early on in my career. And I would put them to the side, and I would do a lot of low-level monitoring and listening to my mix when I felt like I was getting close. Like, essentially what I would do, my whole approach to mixing is like, very few people that are going to listen to the song I worked on are going to be sitting in front of a pair of monitors, like dead center in a mix position and experiencing the song. Most people are going to, be listening to these songs that I'm working on, cooking dinner or driving, or in the background when they're spending time with friends or chilling out on a back porch. So what I'll do is I'll get a mix close, and then I'll kick them over to the right at low level and take care of some emails or, do some, just kind of, or like mess around on the web and look like check out, like browse the web for a little bit and just experience the song, kind of like doing other things. And it's crazy how many times like I'll just experience the song while I'm doing something else and something will pop out or it will confirm that, man, this feels right. So I kind of just try to take myself out of the song a little bit and do something else, but still be listening. And if I find that, listening low level to the side, not in dead center mix position, helps me give a little bit of a different perspective and helps me make some choices.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that approach. And it makes sense. It's like, yeah, we spend so much time listening in this perfect situation, ideally, where, we've got all of the right gear in front of us and the perfectly measured out positions, that kind of thing. But no one else is listening that way. So you have to consider it the other way. So then as far as like the translation side of things goes, then, listening in these different positions, like how does that impact your decisions about mixed translation? Like, are you still listening for specific things in certain points of your room, or how does that look?
No, not really, man. I make sure that the bass and kick and all that low end stuff feels right in mixed position. And then I'll bounce around. But I find that AirPods are incredibly helpful to check mixes on. And I really, really recommend young mixers getting a pair of AirPods and checking their mixes on them. I find that if it sounds good in them, it really translates. So often before I send the mix out, or if I'm working on a record and I have a couple mixes, like I'll just print them, text them to myself, and I'll go on a walk and just listen to them on AirPods and check them. As far as besides that, like I don't really go around and listen to mixes in multiple arenas. Like I just trust my room, and so far so good as far as translation goes.
Yeah, well, it makes sense. You know the room, you know the gear, you know what you're supposed to expect out of it, and yeah. If it sounds different, then you fix it. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's the reason why like a lot of people trust do the car test. It's like that's just like a place that they're comfortable with. They've heard a million songs in their cars, so they trust those speakers, and that's why they do it.
Yeah, but it's funny. Like sometimes I'll have a client that'd be like, "Hey, you want to go out in the car and listen?" And I'm like, "No, thank you. Like you go listen. Let me know what you're feeling." But like, I just really trust my room and rely on that.
Of course. And if you go in someone else's car, like you're not familiar with that setup, so it's going to sound weird to you.
No, it'll send my mind spiraling. So
yeah, just because it's a car doesn't mean that it's accurate.
No, but I put a lot of virtue. In fact, sometimes I'll have a client come out and close out a record or a song, and I'll literally stream the mix to them, and they'll be in my freaking driveway in their car listening to the mix, and we're making tweaks, with them listening in the car via Bluetooth on audio movers, and so I mean, so much of my feedback comes from cars, and I have no problem with that. It's like this the place they listen to music the most. So, but for me, I rely on my room, but I 100% encourage my clients to listen wherever they're comfortable.
Of course, yeah. So then, at the end of the day, like, what ultimately makes a great sounding mix in your mind?
I've never been asked that question before. I think space, dynamic range, and the song being appropriately loud to the content that it's trying to achieve. Those are the kind of the three things: space, dynamic range, scene changes, and there's nothing worse than a song being louder than it needs to be, or there's nothing, you know what I'm saying? There's sometimes songs I feel like beautifully organic or like, more spacious, less striving productions. Like when they're pushed too far, it really grieves me. And on the other side, it's like when there's a tight pop production that is carved and crafted in a way, there's like nothing better than a song like ripping at -5, -4 and like not distorting, like, but it's so song specific. Like those are the kind of the things that I really look for in a finished product.
Love it. I think I agree with all of that. And especially like the scene changes thing. I think that's something that a lot of people forget about. They keep like a static mix, and it can really make a mix sound exciting when you have those scene changes.
Oh yeah. And I find that just like drastic EQing in sections really help. Like in like a verse 2 of like a drum, sometimes I'll carve out 80 hertz and below and like darken it 3 dB on the top. and all of a sudden the drum's still there and they kick, but then the chorus kicks in and they're like full fidelity, and all of a sudden it tricks the ear to this massive expansion of the music, and you're not sure why, stuff like that, little tricks like that.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I often hear people talk about, like, when it comes to the width, like they'll talk about volume or they'll talk about panning and moving things in and out. But I think that the frequency thing is a really important topic and a really important element of that it does make things feel bigger. And yeah, I mean, you only have left and right speakers. You can't really go much wider beyond that. So you have to figure out a creative way to make it sound exciting and to make it feel like it grows wider and darker and brighter and, have all that movement within a mix. So I think it's a really cool approach, man. Dude, Sean, this has been amazing. Like, I've really enjoyed learning more about this process and everything you're up to. If people want to learn more about you, potentially even work with you, like, what's the best way for them to do that?
You just hit me up on Instagram. I don't have a website. I know that's probably a bad thing. I just haven't done it. But Instagram's a great way to hit me up. You can direct message me. I try to do a very good job of keeping people updated what I'm doing on that platform, and that's the best way to get me.
Awesome. I'll definitely include that in show notes for people.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate the time. I'm honored to be a part of this.
Thank you. It's been awesome. So that was my interview with Sean Moffitt, and I really enjoyed learning more about his approach to creating width in a mix and how he likes to use automation with frequencies to make things sound like things are darker or brighter and to get more width in a mix. And I think that that's a really interesting approach because we often just think of width as something that is entirely based on panning. But when you add that frequency element to it, it really can expand what's available to you and make things feel a little bit darker, a little bit brighter, and create depth on the sides in addition to width. So I think that his approach to frequency-based automations is a really cool way of doing it, and it's going to make your mixes sound more exciting. If you listen to Sean's mixes, you're going to hear that things grow in the choruses. They get bigger, they get brighter, and certain elements get tucked away, and there's a lot of activity going on in the mix. But I think that that's why his mixes sound as great as they do. So, these little details, it's not just about making something move wider with panning. It's about thinking about positioning in the mix and front to back. And that all has to do with frequency balance. So I love that Sean talked about that there as well. I also thought it was interesting to hear how he likes to actually start his mixes from the sessions that the producers give him. And I think that that is something that, like he said, it requires a lot of plugins to make it work right. It requires the knowledge of different DAWs to do. But when you take that approach, you're definitely preserving all of that original intent that an artist has or that a producer has. And so it is a really cool way of starting from where the artist envisions their tracks and what they've done to the best of their abilities. And then it allows you to expand on your work. So you're not just starting from the ground up and having to reinvent things. It really does kind of springboard the mix and get you much further along than, having to try to build it from the ground up again, right? So I thought that was a really cool approach too. And it was interesting to hear how he will take things from different DAWs and then manipulate all that to get it inside of his DAW to work with his workflow and his setup. So definitely a cool approach to mixing. And, like I said, it does require a little bit of knowledge and it does require some plugins and stuff. But I think if you did that, it would save you a lot of time. And as we talked about, you probably learn a lot in the process of doing that as well. So I learned a lot on this podcast. I hope that you did too. If you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to subscribe. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And if you're currently working on your mixes, if you're not quite sure what you need to be doing to get the sounds that you hear in your head to come out of your speakers, and you want some one-on-one actionable feedback to make your song sound every bit as good as you've always wanted, I would love to help you out with that. And inside of my coaching program, Amplitude, I work one-on-one with my students to give you a repeatable process for all of your production stages. From writing your songs, to recording, to editing, to mixing, making sure that you're doing every stage to the best of its abilities so that you're guaranteeing success and that you can make your song sound just like your favorite recordings. So if you're interested in getting that one-on-one feedback and learning that process so that you can get better results, cut down your mix time, and just ultimately feel more proud of the music you're working on, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details on that website there. And then let's hop on a call. I'd love to learn more about your process and how I can truly help you. And if it seems like it can help you, then we can talk about what it would look like to work in that program on that call. So if you're interested, make sure, again, check out masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details there. Last but not least, I want to give one last shout out to Samply, our podcast sponsor. They're an amazing company, and if you're someone who's dealing with a lot of mix revisions with your clients, they make the process of mix revisions super easy. So make sure to go check them out online at samply.app. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around. Can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.